The first night was an introduction where we learned various odds and ends about the setup of the festivals, why they're important, why they've been lost in the church. One thing I'll remind you from the introduction that I think is of great importance, and it's what Verlinda was talking about. Israel was on a roller coaster with God. They went from high points to low points, from high points to low points. And every time they got into a low point, and God would bring them back, and they would experience revival, two things were key to those revivals: the temple ordinances and the festivals. And from that we learn that the festivals are key to both corporate and personal revival.
Amen.
And so if we will honor the Lord's festivals in our hearts, and remember, when I say that, we've discussed this battle of, are we supposed to keep the festivals? And key to understanding that is the difference between shadow and substance. God's moral law passes through the cross unchanged. His moral law. His ceremonial law passes through the cross and undergoes a transition from shadow to substance. And so if we will keep the spiritual substance of the festivals, we will experience revival on an individual level and corporately. I believe it is key. So last week then, the second session, we looked at Passover. Jesus is our Passover lamb. He rode into Jerusalem on the day Passover lambs were selected. For 5 days, the lambs were inspected for fault or blemish. Jesus was inspected over those same days for fault or blemish by the chief priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, Pilate, you name it, examining, all trying to find fault with him. And Pilate's declaration, you take him and crucify him. I find no fault in him. Excuse me. So Jesus is our Passover lamb. We will touch on a few more of those tonight because the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins with the Passover Seder. So we will touch on those aspects of what Jesus did and what the Passover Seder means to us. But tonight we come to the second festival, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, A12 HaMatzah. So this is the cover sheet, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this except to read through it because we'll come back to it at the end of the night. And as a summary, you will look at this sheet and you will be able to understand the volumes that are hidden behind this page. So a key theme verse, one worth memorizing. If you want to memorize verses in connections with the festivals, here's a key verse for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who were once not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Every festival has at least one object of focus. The object of focus for Passover was the Passover lamb. The object of focus for the Feast of Unleavened Bread is unleavened bread. Jesus is our Passover lamb. Guess who the chief example of unleavened bread is? Jesus, without leaven, until he took our leaven upon himself. But we'll look at that too. So the central theme of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the initiation of covenant relationship. Oftentimes, if you'll listen to people teaching on the festivals, they'll say Passover is the death, unleavened bread is the burial, and first fruits is the resurrection. Well, they're getting two of the three correct. And you can loosely place the burial with unleavened bread, yes. But is the theme of the burial of Christ on the same par of importance as the death and the resurrection of Jesus? Do we have doctrine based on the death of Jesus on the cross? We have doctrine based on the resurrection. Do we really have solid, important doctrine based on the burial? I'm not saying it's obsolete or unimportant, but compare the burial with saying that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the commencement of the new covenant. Is the new covenant a monumental prophetic event in connection with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Most certainly. And we also looked at the fact that the Passover Seder for Israel was, first of all, a reinstatement of the Abrahamic covenant, but it was a commencement of the Mosaic covenant. That's what the Passover Seder is. It is a covenant meal. So it is this festival is initiation of covenant relationship. When we look at how the festivals coincide with the wedding tradition, the Jewish wedding traditions, it is the betrothal. Is the betrothal a covenant between a man and a woman to become married? Yes. This is the Passover Seder is the betrothal meal. So central themes, in addition to initiation of covenant relationship, there is the sanctification of the chosen people, and the consecration of his holy priests. Now, this will all make a whole lot more sense as we go through the evening. So, there are lots of verses that you can read about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Passover has lots of instructions. Unleavened bread has lots of instructions. And some of this is actually from the Passover chapter. I am just going to be reading the bold letters here, bold letter sentences, so that we can catch the main gist of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So, for I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night. What night is he talking about? The lambs were slain on the 14th day at evening. That means as it's transitioning from the 14th to the 15th day. So the Passover of the death angel is actually in conjunction with the Passover meal and on the 15th day of the month. So we're talking about the 15th day of the month. What's he going to do? I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both male, man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on your houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. And on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. So all of this instruction, well, that's on the next slide. So this slide or this page in your booklet is a summary of what all we're going to be going through tonight. So the only thing that I won't really touch on in the later teaching of tonight is perhaps this verse right here. This summarizes the Jewish understanding of why unleavened bread. And the Jewish understanding does not capture the full essence of what this festival is all about. So why did they eat unleavened bread? Why do the Jewish people understand that they eat unleavened bread? Because it's in remembrance that they left Egypt so quickly that the bread did not have time to rise. So it is not a rehearsal, but it's a reenactment of their exodus. So let's read the verse. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. So there is further understanding about leaven, because there's a Jewish concept of something called haratz. Now I can't even remember the name of it. I can't pronounce it. Yatzahara, the evil inclination. The evil inclination is something that is associated with leaven, but that's for a later night. So the rest of this is just stuff that we're going to cover as the evening goes on. So now from that passage that we just read about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, there are three major commands that we need to grasp. And who knew there could be 2 hours of teaching on these three commands? The first is, on the first day you shall remove all leaven from your house. So the removal of leaven is the first command that we will look at. The second command is, for 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Then the third command, a part A and a part B, on the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation. Now, what does that mean? We looked at this last week with Passover. A holy convocation means that these days, the 15th and the 21st, were to be regarded as Sabbath days regardless of what day of the week they fell on. So all the rules and laws that are associated with Sabbath days, these are high Sabbath days, special Sabbaths that might or might not be on a regular weekly Sabbath. In the case of unleavened bread, if one of them is on a Sabbath day, the other one will not be. Okay, because they're not a complete 7 days apart. The first day and the last day are 6 days apart. So you can't have two Sabbaths. But anyway, that's immaterial. So remove leaven from your houses. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. And on the first day there shall be a holy convocation. And on the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation. So let's deal with the first command. On the first day you shall remove chametz from your houses. Now, according to some tradition, chametz was to be removed from the homes by no later than the 14th. We find this in, what's his name, Mike? No, the Jewish writer. Josephus, the writings of Josephus. The writings of Josephus tell us that they were to remove leaven by noon. That is except, remember that's on the 14th. The command is, on the first day you shall remove all leaven. But the Jewish law is you're to remove it all on the 14th, not the first day, which would be the 15th. However, in order to keep the command, some of them will traditionally keep a small pile of leaven in the home, and as part of the Seder rituals, they will brush it up, and then they will ceremonially take it out, and we'll look at that in a minute, and the next day they'll burn it. So technically, they're removing the leaven from their homes on the 15th, on the first day of the unleavened bread. So shortly after sundown, thus legally on the 15th day, and equipped with a lamp or candle, a feather, and a wooden spoon, a family observing the Passover searches the house one last time for leaven. When found, the leaven is swept into the wooden spoon using the feather and taken out of the house. This ceremonial search for leaven is called Bedikat Shametz. Having removed all leaven from the house, the following declaration is made, in Hebrew, of course. All leavened food and grain fermentation that are in my possession, that I have not seen or removed, shall be null and considered as the dust of the earth, covering all bases here. So if I didn't find it, it doesn't exist. Then sometime the following morning, before noon, the leaven and the feather and the wooden spoon, now you understand why they use all burnable items, were all burned, and the following declaration made. Any leaven that may still be in the house that I have or have not seen, that I have or have not removed, shall be as if it does not exist and as the dust of the earth. This ritual is called Be'er Shametz, burning of the leaven. So, this is a little interesting side note. Most of you are very familiar with the old-time tradition of spring cleaning. Are you not? Well, where does spring cleaning come from? Well, if you Google it, they say that the oldest tradition springs from a Persian tradition called Haneh Takani, which means literally the shaking of the house. It occurs at the same time of year that Passover traditionally occurs. And if you look a little bit deeper, they trace it back to a religious group called the Zoroastrians. Now, the interesting thing about the Zoroastrians is that they formed around 500 BC. What was going on around 500 BC in Persia? Well, the fall of Jerusalem was in 586. So this is and by 530, Babylon had fallen, and Persia, the Medes and the Persians had taken over. And the Jewish people would be dispersed throughout the Persian Empire for the next couple hundred years. Some of them would return, but not all of them. Well, isn't it interesting that this is the same period of time that the Persian ritual for shaking the house seems to originate? Something that the Jews had already been doing for more than 1,000 years. A spring cleaning, removing leaven from the house. So that's just a little side note. So what does all this mean? What does Shametz, leaven, symbolize? So understanding the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins with first understanding some symbolism. Let's begin with bread. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Just what does bread symbolize? From Wikipedia, bread is a staple food prepared from dough and flour and water, usually by baking. Throughout recorded history, it has been popular around the world and is one of the oldest artificial foods, having been of importance since the dawn of agriculture. A staple food, sometimes simply referred to as staple, a food that is eaten routinely and in such quantities that it constitutes a dominant portion of a standard diet in a given population, supplying a large fraction of needs for energy-rich materials and generally a significant portion of the intake of other nutrients as well. Most people live on a diet based of just a small number of staples. So, inherent to understanding bread is that it is a foundational food for life. And that's our physical life. Foundational. And that's what this says here. Food necessary to sustain physical life. But this merely helps us understand the physical, natural side of the symbolism. What does bread represent spiritually? Deuteronomy 8:2-3. So he humbled you, allowing you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your father know. that he might make you know. Now catch this. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So spiritually, bread is a symbol for the Word of God, and we cannot do without it. It is our staple food as Christians. Job 23:12 says, I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. How could Moses fast for 40 days and 40 nights, come back down to the golden calf incident, turn around and fast another 40 days and 40 nights, and then go back up the mountain and fast another 40 days and 40 nights, a total of 120 days? How could Moses have survived physically fasting with 2 meals in the interim, but almost a total span of 120 days? Because in the presence of God is the Word of God, and even physical life can be sustained by the spiritual Word of God, the spiritual bread. So bread is a symbol for the Word of God. More specifically, unleavened bread is a symbol for the uncorrupted Word of God. Uncorrupted by Satan, uncorrupted by demonic influence, uncorrupted by man, and uncorrupted by even our own vain imagination. Let me just throw in here, those of you who believe in and operate in prophetic words, I ask you a simple question. Did you ever get a word that you knew was from God, but it didn't play out the way that you thought it was going to? It has happened to me, most definitely. Why didn't it play out the way you thought it was going to? Because you interjected your leaven into it. Be careful with what you do with a word from the Lord. Even our own vain imagination. As we shall see in the following verses, unleavened bread also represents sincerity and truth. So, this is kind of a cover sheet, just a neat summary. We're going to look at a couple of these more in depth, especially these verses about leaven in the New Testament. So how do you find out what does something mean in the Old Testament? You search for that word in the New Testament and you see what's being said about it. So we're going to do that with leaven. But so here's a cover statement from Paul, from the Holy Spirit through Paul about leaven. So leaven in the Old Testament, you're thinking just yeast that you would put in bread, okay? But now Paul is giving us a New Testament, a spiritual definition of leaven. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? This is a little dangerous here. Sorry. Bump that. That a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Now he's using the illustration physically of bread and yeast, but he's speaking about a spiritual principle. Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you might be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness. All right, there you have a defining statement. Leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now, there are some things in this verse that are of key importance. First of all, notice, since you truly are unleavened. Those who have entered into covenant with Jesus Christ are unleavened. Period. But now look at the rest of the sentence. Therefore, keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. If you don't have any leaven, how could you have leaven to purge out? If you have leaven to purge out, how can you be unleavened? This is a dilemma. But you have to understand, as we will see later in this evening, sanctification, which the Feast of Unleavened Bread is also sometimes called the Feast of Sanctification. Sanctification is a process. We have been sanctified, we are being sanctified, and we will be sanctified. We have been sanctified positionally before God. We are unleavened. And that should be our attitude. But in the process of being sanctified, we must keep the feast and keep leaven out of our lives. Positionally, we are unleavened. But experientially, we must deal with it. And future, it'll all be removed. And we won't have to deal with it anymore. Paul says, "Oh, wretched man that I am." Okay? So, beware of the leaven which doth corrupt. Leaven is a type of sin, evil, and corruption. Leaven symbolizes those things which have the ability to influence in either a positive or negative way. However, in Scripture, it is mainly used as a symbol of corrupting influence. Now listen, leaven is not to be understood just as the sin itself, but that it has the empowering to corrupt everyone around it. It doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone you come in contact with. Our sin, as much as we would like to think it is compartmentalized to our own lives and we're the only ones that receive recompense because of our sin, is a false concept. Our sin wounds us and everyone around us because leaven is corrupting influence. So now we're going to look at these, so I'm just going to read them here. The leaven of Sadducees, the leaven of Pharisees, the leaven of Herod, the leaven of Corinth, the leaven of Galatia, the leaven of this world, the leaven of covetousness, and then we're going to see this last one. I'm not even going to read it right now. So let's go and look. The first mentions of leaven in the New Testament are from the words of Jesus. So if Jesus has something to say about leaven, then it's probably going to be applicable to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Jesus said to them, "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." So the disciples were thinking what? The leaven of bread. And they had to have their thinking rearranged. Then they understood he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Do I need to point out that in this instructions that Jesus gave his disciples, if the church had followed these instructions, we would not be in the denominational mess that we are in. It is the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It is the leaven of denominations. It is the leaven that is in, that we add to the Word of God, that puts us in dire straits because we have not kept the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that's the first one, false doctrine, bad doctrine. Then Jesus said to his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Now, I would rather I think I would rather have a hypocrite as President of the United States as having those who have no fear of God absolutely whatsoever. Because at least a hypocrite lays out the law of God and tells you to follow it, though their life is in shambles. Now, I may get a rebuke for that, but I mean, the absence of the fear of the Lord in our nation is an abomination. So a third one, leaven of the world. And he charged them, saying, take heed of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now this one is usually interpreted as the leaven of the world. And the leaven of the world is a very legitimate concept. There are scriptures that say that pure and holy religion before God is to keep oneself unstained from the world, to keep yourself free from the leaven of the world. I think there is room to understand this a little bit differently, and we're going to look at this in a little bit. But the leaven of Pharisees and the leaven of Herod could also be the leaven of the pride of life, being lifted up, being elevated. I am the one who is in charge. Now, it wasn't this Herod. It was the Herod that was alive when Jesus was born. He was so full of the kind of leaven that I'm talking about right now that he didn't want anybody who could challenge his authority and wanted Jesus killed. He wanted unquestioned power and authority. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, remember Jesus tells the thing about sitting at the important places of the table. And Jesus says, no, sit at the lowest spot. And then when you won't be embarrassed when you're invited up. And you have to move, those people have to move out of the way so that you can sit down. Let's look at some other leavens. So now those are the previous page are leavens that Jesus mentions directly. We're going to see some more leaven, I think, that he mentions in a little bit, but he does not call it leaven. But the leaven of immorality, where do we find this? We find this in Corinthians. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality that is not even named among the Gentiles. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. You're positionally unleavened. Don't allow this in your midst. So the leaven of immorality. And then again with Paul, he talks about the leaven of legalism. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which God has made us free. Do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. Indeed, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. And may I suggest here to those that have an ear to hear that you could substitute something else in here for circumcision and be dealing with the same thoughts that Paul is talking about. And what might I be suggesting? If I say to you that you must keep the Sabbath, Christ will profit you nothing. If you're going to make a big deal about the physical law of keeping the Sabbath, Christ will profit you nothing. And if you follow that law, that you must keep the Sabbath, you are a debtor to keep the whole law. So don't think so highly of yourself just because you're able to keep one law. Let's see how you're doing with the other 613. You have become estranged from Christ. You who attempt to be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. So his concluding remark, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. So again, we're exposing what the New Testament has to say about leaven. There is the leaven of legalism, and there is legalism in the church. And not just in those who believe in keeping the Sabbath on the Jewish Saturday. Now, these are leavens that I have pulled out because some of the language is the same as passages that talk about leaven, but the word leaven is not specifically mentioned in these. Nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him, in Jesus. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praises of men more than the praises of God. So this is the leaven, I call this the leaven of prestige. We would rather save face among the administration than be in right relationship with God. Jesus said to them in his teaching, beware of the scribes and the desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplace, the best seats in the synagogue, the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive the greater condemnation. Again, the leaven of prestige. Then there's the leaven of covetousness. Again, these verses don't contain the word leaven, but you can see corrupting influence written all over these attitudes. And he said to them, take heed and beware of covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of things that he possesses. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and have pierced themselves through with many sorrows. So now we come to the overarching understanding of what is leaven all about. I have given you some specific instances in Scripture to bring out the essence of what leaven is really talking about. But there is a much broader categorization of what leaven is. And this is it. Purge out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. See, unleavened, Jesus is the example of unleavened bread, uncorrupted. And we are to become like him. So unleavened bread is a picture of the very nature and character of Christ. And leavened bread is a picture of lives that are corrupted by sin and worldly desires and so on and so forth. We can sum it up by the old nature. Leavened bread is speaking of the old nature, and unleavened bread speaks of the nature and the character of Christ. So we are to be putting off the old nature and putting on the nature and character of Christ. So somebody, would you please look up Ephesians 4:17 through 32? I want you to get a flavor of this, and also Galatians 5, 16 through 26. And also notice that this last reference up here at the bottom, 2 Peter 3, 1 through 4, I believe that is incorrect. I believe that should be 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 4. So you may want to mark that down. But I don't remember, but I looked at it and I said, why did I put this verse in the run? And about 30 minutes later, I thought, let me check Timothy, and boom, there it was. So it had the themes of unleavened and leaven. So who do I have a couple people look? Who's getting Ephesians and who's getting Galatians? Okay, go ahead and read while somebody else is going to Ephesians. Yes.
I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill
Now watch this. The works of the flesh are evidence. Now he's going to give you a list of leaven. Go ahead.
Which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentiousness, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, disseminations, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, this I also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God.
How important is it to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Pretty important. Go on, Ernie.
The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law.
See there? So what is that? That is unleavened. Unleavened, the nature and character of Christ.
And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another.
All right. Okay, so does somebody have the Ephesians passage? But I think you get the gist of this leaven and unleavened. Leaven represents the old nature, the old man, corrupted by the world, corrupted by immorality, corrupted, puffed up, prideful. And unleavened, to be unleavened, is to be carrying the very nature and character of Christ. So now we're moving on. We understand the reason for getting leaven, and we're gonna start into aspects that are covered in the Seder. But I just want you to see an overall picture of what's happening with these first three festivals: Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. First of all, over here on this side, we have the lamp, the feather, and the spoon, which are the removal of leaven. And the water basin for washing hands is also a symbol for sanctification, for removing the dust of the earth. So on this side of the table, you have that aspect of unleavened bread, of getting out the old leaven. Now, the wine and the bread are symbols of covenant. So on this table you have, is it not? Where else do we eat wine and bread? Communion, okay? So this is communion. This is our first communion. This is the body and the blood. So the body and the blood, okay, I'm gonna say volumes here. Most of you have heard me say this before. Why are we unleavened? Because of the body and the blood. Positionally before God, we have been made unleavened. But we are being sanctified. How are we being sanctified? These same symbols now mean something else. Not the body, but the Word of God. And not the blood, but the Spirit of the living God. How are we being sanctified? Through the Word and through the Spirit. Unforgotten the forgotten or the untaught second half of communion. It's not just about the body and the blood. It's about the indwelling. When you eat something and drink something, do you take it in? The indwelling of the living Word and the Spirit of the living God. That is what sanctifies us. Okay? And then these two candles over here, do you remember what they are? They're the Shabbat candles. Well, what's important about that on the table? Well, look, you must partake of the new covenant Seder to enter into his rest. You enter into his rest, which is Shabbat, by partaking of the covenant bread and the covenant wine. because he's done the work for you. That is the true Sabbath of the new covenant, not a weekly observance. Though there is nothing wrong if you feel personally convicted to worship on the Sabbath, there's absolutely nothing wrong with you doing that. But do not judge your brother or sister.
Yes, that's good.
All right, so there's a picture of the Seder table, and we're going to be discussing a little bit more of some of the significance. What is the prophetic significance of the Passover Seder? The Passover Seder is the covenant meal. One only has to look at the Last Supper, as far as the Last Supper, to see this. You can't really see this covenant meal from the Old Covenant. But if Jesus takes the time to say, this is my body and this is the blood of the new covenant, you know you're dealing with a covenant meal. So then normally we must look at the Old Testament first, the shadow, and bring it forward to understand the substance. But here Jesus gives us the substance, and we can go back and apply it to the shadow too. So that's why I say the Seder was a reinstatement of the Abrahamic covenant and the commencement of the Mosaic covenant. So, these verses here were just what Jesus said. This is the new covenant in my blood. And to further strengthen this, Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you do not have life in you. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me and I in him. And later in that same passage, Jesus said, the disciples were complaining and saying, do you not understand that this is a hard statement? And he said, look, I'm not talking about physical things. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak are spirit and are life. Again, the word and the spirit, the indwelling of the word and the spirit are part of what Jesus is saying about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. Unless you take in the words and the spirit of him, you have no life in you. So to enter into new covenant with God, one must necessarily eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood. That is, partake of the true Passover, the new covenant Seder. Now look, how could Jesus give his body and his blood to the disciples when he had not yet been sacrificed? So he is explaining to them what they are to understand from his death the following day. And once he has died, now his body and blood are available for the new covenant Seder, and it commences the new covenant. How sad that nobody partook of the new covenant at that time. It took them 3 days before they could really realize what was going on, and then they started rolling in. And by Pentecost, there were 120 of them up in the upper room. Okay, so the Seder is the covenant meal. Can we confirm this covenant concept in the Old Testament? When does God enter into covenant with Israel? So these are just a couple of things to look at. He took the book of the covenant and read before the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said, we will do, and be obedient. Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant the Lord has made with you according to these words. When did this occur? At Mount Horeb. So the Jewish people look at Mount Horeb as when the covenant was ratified. And it is when they agreed to the covenant, to their part of the covenant. But God had already established his covenant with them before it. They're just now starting to line up with God. So let's look at some verses that bring this out. Well, first of all, they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Well, how can you be baptized into Moses at a point when you've not yet entered into the covenant? If the covenant isn't until Mount Sinai, when did the crossing of the Red Sea happen? It happened back here. So this right here is a statement that they were already in covenant. It already happened. You don't get baptized before you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. You get baptized after as an expression of what has happened internally. So this is one statement that tells you, hey, a covenant has already happened. But look at this. Behold, the days are coming, said the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers. When? In the day I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke. Look, it wasn't just any covenant, though I was a husband to them. It was a betrothal covenant that they broke. But when did it happen? The day they left Egypt. What happened the day they left Egypt? That's the 15th of the month. That's why it's a high Sabbath, to remember their deliverance. But what did that day start with? A first Passover Seder. So the covenant goes back to the Passover Seder. And so this paragraph down here is really saying what I've already alluded to. So let's go on. So Passover has two big words with it: redemption and deliverance. Redeem, to purchase, to buy back. Were they sold into the house of slavery? Yes. Redeemed by the blood of God's own firstborn. By the way, let me go back here. Listen, if God said to them, if you will do the Passover lamb and put the blood over the door, I will pass over you. Yeah. Tell me that's not a covenant. It's a covenant. That's right. To deliver, to be set free, unshackled, to break off the chains. These are part of Passover. On the first day you shall remove chametz from your houses. Unleavened bread is justification, sanctification, and consecration. Remove chametz. That's to remove sin, to remove the influence of sin from our lives. Now let's look at justification. The first commandment: remove all leaven from your houses. What is justification? It's being restored to a right standing with God. Being restored to a right standing with God. Now, how many of you have heard this next phrase? Just as if I had never sinned, as an expression of justification. A few of you have? What a horrible half-truth. And that's why I hit this so hard. It's a half-truth. Because it's just as if Jesus had sinned in your place. Because the blame is going on him. It's not just eradicated. You're not getting off scot-free. It's not a presidential pardon unless the one pardoning were to go and finish out the sentence. That would be the complete picture of justification. If somebody would go back and take and fulfill the prison sentence. God doesn't just forgive people. He can only forgive because, listen, God is a just God. Yeah. True justice is summed up in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And when you are pardoned, something of equal or greater value must suffer the consequences for you. It's not just as if I'd never sinned. It's just as if your sin was placed on someone else and just as if they were the one guilty of your sin. That is the completed picture of justification. Our faithful high priest and the removal of all leaven from his house. Now we're going to see how the feasts foreshadowed what Jesus did and also how Jesus kept the feast. So we are his house. We are his glorious temples. Jesus keeping the feasts versus the feasts are prophetic of Jesus. So just an interesting little thing here. Do you realize that Jesus cleansed the temple twice in his earthly ministry? Once at the beginning and once at the end. Okay? Do you realize that both of the times that he did this, it was at Passover time? Yeah. Put two and two together. He's keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He's cleansing his Father's house. You don't see that if you don't have a festival perspective when you read through the New Testament. He's getting the leaven out, the leaven of greed from his Father's house, the zeal of his Father's house. He's keeping the feast. He's driving out the leaven. So, in haste, flee, don't look back. Leave the leaven of Egypt behind. You know, we don't have this attitude towards sin. We do not have this, don't look back. What happened to Lot's wife? What happens when you look back? When you look back, you're drawn back. And most of us don't have the fortitude to say no in looking back. You know, there's this concept of the blessedness of innocence. If you've never sinned in a particular area, you have, it's not natural, but I'll say it this way. You have a natural strength to say no. But once you've tasted it once, you now have a propensity to go back again and again and again. And this is what happens when you look back. The temptation rises right back up in our faces, and we're pulled back into a leavened lifestyle. Exactly what we're not supposed to be doing. Now, let's look at the second half of justification. Just as if Christ had sinned instead of me. True justice demands an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You know, the reason why Jesus tells us to forgive is not just because we're to have a forgiving attitude. The price has been paid. He's paid the price for everyone. And we're going to say some things in a little bit about the difference between justice and vengeance, because they have some similar thoughts to them, but vengeance is you wanting to satisfy the fact that you were wronged. And that's not what justice is all about. That's not true justice. God is a just God. He demands true justice. So this is what I call the great exchange. And we will not look at this in detail until we look at the Day of Atonement. Maybe even in the second semester, when we're looking at this in our personal.
I like that leavened lifestyle. I like that.
The unleavened life or the leavened life?
I like that terminology. That really has.
You're living in corruption.
Yeah, it has an impact though, because most of us don't even think about leaven being a lifestyle. That's a real one of those, aha. It's like a revelation. Thank you. That's good.
So, the great exchange. In the Middle East, covenants were often ratified by the breaking of bread together. We will see this later when we look at the Seder. Well, I've already pointed that out in the Seder. But covenants were also often ratified through the exchange of clothing. What kind of clothing did we have? For all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteousness deals are like a filthy garment. Spiritually speaking, if we could see the realm of the second heaven, people with sin on them would be clothed in filthy garments. Remember the bride, her garments is bright and clean, which is the righteous acts of the saints. So you're either clothed with your, clothes are the first thing that people see when they look at you, hopefully. Verlinda has a house rule about that. Keep your clothes on. So spiritually, people see the actions that you do. Righteous actions are linen garments, bright and clean. Unrighteous actions are filthy garments, dirty and soiled. So we're either walking around spiritually with clean garments or filthy garments. Look at Zechariah 3, 1 through 5. He showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan was standing at his right hand to oppose him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you." When does a high priest stand before the angel of the Lord? Which is is it a euphemism? Is that what we call that? But is a phrase that means standing before the Lord, okay? When does the high priest stand before the Lord? One day a year, the Holy of Holies. So this is a Day of Atonement chapter, but it is also a judgment passage. It's a passage dealing about judgment. It's a Day of Atonement. That is what the Day of Atonement is. It is a day of judgment. So this is a Day of Atonement. Now, the Lord rebuke you. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire? Look, he's chosen Jerusalem. So why is Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord? He's standing there on behalf of the entire nation, not just himself. And how is he clothed? Joshua was clothed in filthy garments and standing before the angel of the Lord. It is my belief that this is a messianic passage disclosing that Jesus had to undergo a great white throne judgment on our behalf. This is what the law demands, that justice be served. The only reason why you won't have to stand at a great white throne judgment is because he has done it for you. He has taken your leaven from you, and that leaven is now on him, and he is judged as though it is his own leaven. Now, there's something missing from this passage. Does anybody know what it is? There's nothing said about the blood here. But we know from Hebrews that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. So the only reason why this can happen, take away the filthy garments from him, see that I have removed your iniquity from you, and I will clothe you with rich robes or festival robes, put a clean turban on his head. So there's a transition that takes place here. The only way this transition can take place is if there is blood involved. It is not, it's missing from the passage. But when you look at the Day of Atonement as a whole, blood is an intrinsic part of what happens. So I'll just say, the only thing that gets Jesus out of this predicament, he pulls out a bowl of his own blood. And he does not speak to the Father, but the blood speaks for him. But we'll look at more of that on the Day of Atonement. He took upon himself our filthy rags and placed upon us his magnificent robes of righteousness. He who knew no sin became the bearer of our iniquity. He took our leaven upon himself that we might be unleavened. For this reason, we will not go through a great white judgment, but we will go through a judgment seat of Christ, which has to do with fulfilling our priesthood. But this ends up in the wrath of God, the great white throne. So Jesus, and there are verses that say this, Jesus endured the wrath of God on our behalf. The human heart indeed cries out for vengeance. Listen, I do not have a full revelation of this. But you know how real of an attitude vengeance is. We all deal with it. I mean, when something horrific happens on the news, the first thing you hear out of people's mouths is, I want them to pay. I want justice served. Listen, that is so strong in all of us because we are made Testing. We back on? So what I'm saying is, the reason why this is such a strong thing in us is we're created in the image of God, and we do have a strong sense of what justice is. The problem is that we add our leaven to it. And the leaven added to justice is vengeance. And Jesus says, or the Lord says, vengeance is His, it is not ours. It is not our right to demand justice because that is a vengeance type thing. So while Satan, the father of lies, stands by whispering in our ears, hold on to that, Jesus says, let it all go. Why can He say that? Because He's already paid the price. Whether they ever receive it or not, He's paid the price. So we are commanded to forgive. So even while He was suffering on the cross, He cried out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The propensity of the human heart is so inclined towards vengeance that God had to place a mark on Cain to protect him, saying, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. Now I want you to catch this. Why did Jesus say, Peter asked Jesus, how many times shall I forgive my brother? And he said, 7 times. And Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Now everybody knows that story. But I don't know that I have ever heard someone explain what is going on here. Why did Jesus say it this way? And so I'm taking you to an Old Testament story here. Cain was afraid that they were going to chase him down and kill him, right? And so God said sevenfold on him. So then a couple chapters later, or 1 chapter later, I don't remember, this dude called Lamech killed someone in self-defense. He's defending himself, and he killed someone. And he claimed his own rule of justice. Isn't that just like us all? What was his rule of justice? If Cain sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. The same numbers that Jesus used in his conversation with Peter. So, what is Jesus really pointing out? He's addressing the human heart and the propensity for vengeance. And he's saying, man wants vengeance until their quote-unquote justice is served, and Jesus is saying, let it go. I'm not saying that the way I want to say that. There's a way to say this best, but boy, I just can't remember how. I don't know why I can't remember it. But we want to demand justice. The sons of Adam demand justice and vengeance. The sons of God forgive. Are we true? Are we sons of Adam, or are we sons of God? Brothers and sisters of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, also I want to point out to you that 70 times 7 is 490, right? That number should raise interest in you because there is a prominent prophecy in Daniel about 490. And I'll also point something else out. Now, this does not work if you believe in a 50-year Jubilee cycle, because what's 50 times 10? 500. But we already went through in the introduction that There's a real possibility it was that the last year, the 50th year, is also the first year of the next cycle. That way you do not mess up your Sabbath year cycles. And Jubilee is always after the 7th Sabbath year. The point is this: on a 49-year cycle, 49 times 10 is 490. So now you're tying in the concept of Jubilee to this. And what is Jubilee? Complete release. Completely release those that are in debt to you. Let's see. So let me read this. With such a great price paid, no wonder unforgiveness brings down hard the gavel of God's vengeance. Why should we grasp so tightly to such petty offenses when He has paid so great of a price for our own sin and secured our forgiveness so that we might stand with confidence justified in the presence of the Holy One? We will look at a later date. What is it like to stand in the presence of God? Given the choice, would you rather spend eternity in heaven or in hell? And I submit to you, it depends on the state of your clothing. Because if you stand there in filthy garments, it will be worse than hell itself. So for God to send you away is an act of His mercy and grace. But if you have white garments on, if you are clothed in His righteousness, there's not a place in all of creation that you would rather be. "7 days you shall eat unleavened bread." So now we're looking at the second command. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So why was Israel commanded to eat unleavened bread? Why 7 days? What's the spiritual significance for this? Okay, let's look at Passover again for a minute. Is there a sacrifice? Do you do something with the blood? Put it over the door and on the lintel. Do you eat of the sacrifice? Partake of the sacrifice? Is none of it to be left over to morning? Correct? I'm trying to come up with the other one. Is it to be eaten with unleavened bread? Yes, you eat it that night with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. So there's Passover. Okay? So I believe the answer lies in Leviticus chapter 8, where we see a similar command given to Aaron and his sons as they were being set apart for priestly service. So these are the commands for being ordained as a priest. Okay? What was supposed to happen? There was an ordination sacrifice. The blood was applied to their thumb and their big toe. They were to eat the meat of the sacrifice with unleavened bread at a specific place. Was the Passover lamb to be eaten at a specific place? Jerusalem. Was the ordination sacrifice to be eaten at a specific place? Yes, at the doorway of the temple. None was to be left over till morning, and the consecration process took 7 days. So do you see what's going on? In the Feast of Unleavened Bread, God is consecrating the entire nation of Israel for their priesthood. Wow. He's ordaining them as priests. Oh. Got it. Now listen, Verlinda has expressed something very important right here. See, the first time through the festivals here, we're looking at the big picture. I say more than I want to say about how it applies personally. And that is by design. I don't want to say a whole lot, but I end up not being able to help myself. But here's the point. When I spell out Revelation to you, it does not mean as much to you. But when the revelation, when there is an atmosphere of revelation, and you get the revelation by the work of the Spirit in your own heart, it sticks. So as we go through the festivals in this first half, you need to be paying attention to the Holy Spirit and applying it to your personal life, even though that's not the focus. We're going through all of the festivals a second time, a second semester. And in that semester, I will spell it out what this means to us personally. But I try to avoid that in this part because I'm laying a foundation. So the point is, she got a revelation. At salvation, it begins immediately with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That means a byproduct of salvation is that you are called as a priest. He consecrates you as a priest. Do you see how closely this all parallels Passover and unleavened bread? It's not a perfect alignment, but the similarities are undeniable and deliberate. Through Passover, the Lord redeemed and delivered and separated the nation from Egypt. Look, I'm probably going to read this in a little bit, but you got to understand something. You can't just pull somebody out of their lifestyle of sin and expect them to not go back. It doesn't work. You have to pull them out and give them purpose in a new life, or it won't stick. You know, I think that's probably part of what's going on when they take prisoners and they try and teach them a vocation while they're in prison, because it's something that they can put to use in the next life. So God didn't just pull them out of Egypt and deliver them and just say, here you go, and let them loose in the wilderness. He took them out of something and placed them in His kingdom to be a kingdom of priests. How many of you have heard that this false statement that, well, in the old covenant only certain people could be priests, but in the new covenant everybody is a priest? How many of you have heard that? That's false. It's false. The whole entire nation of Israel was called to be a priestly nation. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. He was sanctifying them and entering into covenant with them as His own chosen people. But additionally, He was consecrating them for priestly service. How did He sanctify them? Unleavened bread. What is unleavened bread? His word. So He sanctified them by feeding His word. It's His word that set them apart. They were sanctified by His word. What sets Israel apart from all other nations? The Torah, the law, the teachings of God, the word of God. Though the following passage does not occur until Israel reaches Mount Sinai, it explains the consecration process inherent to this Feast of Unleavened Bread. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, to tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you out on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, keep my word, if you will eat unleavened bread, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." The whole nation was a priesthood nation. Israel was called and chosen to be a kingdom of priests. Their priestly function was to carry the knowledge of God to the nations of the earth. And I already gave you one possible example earlier in the night, earlier tonight. Where did spring cleaning come from? This is possibly the influence of the law that had been given to the Jewish people. And that's not the only example that lies out there. To carry out that priestly function, now listen, if He's given you a priesthood, He's got to equip you for it. Yeah. How did He equip them? He gave them a revelation of his word, his Torah. They were equipped with the Torah. What advantage has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. That was their priesthood, to carry the oracles of God, the knowledge of God, to the entire world. God did not just redeem and deliver Israel from Egypt. He called them to himself and gave them purpose. Through the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Lord consecrated and ordained Israel for her priestly service. Through the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, he equipped them. Now I'm going to try and paraphrase this next paragraph. With Israel, it's easy to see the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They already existed as a nation, right? So they kept the feast as a nation. When you translate that into the New Testament, the church does not yet exist. There was no 7-day period right at the beginning of the church that was set apart. So it's hard to see this, but you have to understand. When God was cutting this covenant with Israel for that 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, he was not just cutting covenant with them. He was cutting covenant with all that would come after them. And that is the sense in which we must see the Feast of Unleavened Bread with the church. All that was to come after these events at the commencement of the church, as people come into the body of Christ, they are being ordained as priests and must fulfill that priestly call in their life. So let's see the parallel verse in the New Covenant. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. So this is the only difference. A holy nation, his own special people. What is our priesthood? That you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light, who were once not a people, but are now the people of God. So let me spell out the differences here. Israel was called to carry the oracles of God, the law, the Torah, the instruction to the ends of the earth. That's not our call. Our call is to proclaim the praises of him. What is that? The gospel. They were to proclaim the law. The wages of sin is death. The church is to proclaim, but the free gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. The other difference is a royal priesthood. This may not be correct thinking, but look, if the church is going to be married to Jesus and Jesus is a king, that makes the church a queen. That makes her royalty. And since her job is to serve him, we have a royal priesthood. The unleavened bread by which we are consecrated is not so much the Torah, but the gospel. It's the gospel that sets us apart and defines the church as a people. But he has entrusted and equipped us with the gospel. Our priestly function is to proclaim the gospel and, you don't see this all the time, the gospel and the message of the kingdom to the ends of the earth. And there is a difference. I'm not saying that I have a good enough revelation to expound on that, but we are to preach the gospel and the message of the kingdom. And the message of the kingdom has to do with, for this reason he came, to undo the works of the evil one. It is the message of the kingdom is a combatant attitude against the kingdom of darkness. And let me just leave it there. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Why does he say that? Because he's turning around and he's giving that authority to us. It's the only reason why he says that. Therefore, go and make disciples of the nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things I've commanded you. Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. And as you go, preach saying the kingdom of God is at hand. And in the kingdom message, there are signs that follow. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, and cast out demons. Freely you've received, freely give. Now, remember we looked at the Passover lamb and how every detail of the Passover lamb, from the selection day to the inspection to the slaying at the time, and what else with the lamb? That it was to be eaten, not a bone of its body was to be broken. All of these things pointed to Jesus, from shadow to substance. Now we're going to do the same kind of thing with the unleavened bread that's on the Seder table. So who has believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form of comeliness that we should see him. There is no beauty that we should desire him. He's despised and rejected of man. You know, when you look at a piece of unleavened bread, there's really not much that stimulates the palate. It's pretty plain. Acquainted with grief, we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised. What is this manna? You remember they got tired of the manna? What is this? All we have to eat is manna. We esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Now, these are some of the same verses, but you'll notice that they are from different versions of the Bible because they pick out words here that you're going to see in a minute. He was wounded for our transgression. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. With his stripes we are healed. So in the New American Standard, but he was pierced through for our transgression. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastisement of our well-being was upon him. By his scourging we were healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid upon him the iniquity of us all. Remember, we've already talked about this tonight. Laid on him the iniquity of us all. So that's just a brief look at what goes into the making of bread. Well, the wheat is thrashed to remove the hull. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. The wheat is crushed into fine flour. He was crushed for our iniquities. The bread is pierced through. He was pierced through for our transgression. The bread is discolored by the fire. He was bruised for our iniquity. The bread is striped from the grill. By his stripes we are healed. Unleavened bread, the matzah on the table, is a symbolic picture of Jesus Christ, and it is called the bread of affliction. So Yeshua, the true unleavened bread, he was born in Bethlehem, which means house of bread, the bread of heaven, the bread of life. He was without sin until he took our sin upon himself. 3 pieces of matzah are wrapped. This is on the Seder plate. It's called the unity plate. Are wrapped in linen napkins and placed on a plate in preparation for the Seder. The middle piece of bread is removed from the unity plate and broken. Half is eaten. Corinthians says, when he had given thanks, he brake it and said, "Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The other half is wrapped in a napkin. Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and hidden away. He laid it in his own new tomb and hewn out in the rocks, and he rolled away a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. At the close of the Seder meal, the middle piece of bread is sought by the children and returned to the table for a ransom. The bread returns. He arose from the grave. So even in the rituals of the Passover Seder, there is a picture of the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ in connection with the unleavened bread. Isn't all that fascinating? So really the wine has to do with his blood, and it has to do with the Spirit. So we're not going to really go through this. I've talked a lot about this when we've done the Passover Seder, but this is more for the Spirit side of things is more for next week. But there are 4 cups in the Passover Seder, and they point to the I will statements found here in Exodus. The first cup is I will bring you out. It's the cup of sanctification, kos kiddushin. I will deliver you, kos Yeshua esse. You notice the name of Jesus embedded here because his name means to save. All right? And it's the cup of deliverance, cup of salvation. I will redeem you, the cup of redemption, kos geula. I can't say this. Geula. And I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. I like to call that the kos hartza'ah, the cup of acceptance. He is accepting us as his people, and we are accepting him as our God. The typical names that you will find for this is the cup of praise, the cup of hope, and the cup of expectancy. So now, we got the bull by the tail, and we're on the downhill swing. We're doing a summary, but you know with me what a summary means. Okay? On the first day you shall remove all leaven from your homes. This simple little command and the traditions that developed in obedience to fulfill it foreshadow the effect of Messiah's death on the cross. Through his sacrifice of taking all our leaven upon himself, he who knew no sin became sin on our behalf. He paid the penalty of death for us. In doing so, he has made us, his bride, to be unleavened, holy, without spot or blemish. Praise his name. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. In this chapter, I've sought to unveil how the Feast of Unleavened Bread so beautifully foreshadowed the work of Messiah and reminds us of so many aspects of our salvation. The unleavened bread itself represents several things, Jesus being primary. But there are 4 names for the bread that I like to use to help remember the more important details of the festivals. I want to be clear, not all of these are scriptural/traditional names for the unleavened bread of Shag HaMatzah, but are all legitimate names expressing biblical concepts relevant to the feast. So in other words, the bread of affliction is a name that is associated with the unleavened bread of Passover. What does the bread of affliction remind us of? It reminds us of the suffering of Messiah, who was afflicted by God in our place, whose broken body paid the penalty for our sin and set us free from our own bitter affliction of life snared in slavery to sin. So the bread of affliction gives us these insights about him. He was afflicted for us, and the life that we would have lived in bondage to sin, the affliction of sin. So the second one, I don't believe is a biblical name. None of the bread of sanctification might be. These other 2 are not. But the bread, let's call it the bread of the covenant. It reminds us that through the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, Yeshua invites us to partake of the covenant meal that we might enter into covenant relationship with him, even betrothal. Number 3, as the bread of sanctification, it reminds us that we have been separated from the world as a distinct chosen people. We have been, are being, and will be made holy, sanctified by and through the body and blood, and through the indwelling of the living Word and the Holy Spirit. And finally, it's the bread of consecration. It reminds us that we have been chosen, called, ordained, commissioned, equipped as royal priests in the kingdom of the Father to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth. Oh, the riches of his glory and the surpassing greatness of his grace and power towards us who believe. So now we look at the last 2 commands. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a holy convocation. Is there meaning for these? You better believe it. Why is the first day of unleavened bread a high Sabbath day? Why is it a holy convocation? Because it's the day of his covenant. Listen, do you celebrate your wedding day every year? God celebrates his betrothal to us annually through this festival. And he doesn't want us to ever remember this is the day that we formed covenant with him. It's an eternal reminder that he has brought us into covenant with himself. Jesus could say, well, how could Jesus say, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, when the most horrendous hours of eternity lay before him? It was the joy of knowing that through his death, he was making provision for a new and living covenant. It was his anticipation of entering into the covenant with his beloved bride that he was so earnestly zealous for. How did he endure the cross? Because of the joy that was set before him. He despised the pain because he was cutting covenant with us. And that covenant was precious, and we'll remember it for eternity. And this is why the first day is a holy Sabbath day. So why is the last day, the seventh day of unleavened bread, a high Sabbath? Unleavened bread, Hag HaMatzah, is known as the Feast of Sanctification. Sanctification is an ongoing, lifelong process. We have been made holy through the cross of Christ. We are being made holy through the indwelling presence of the Word and the Holy Spirit. We will be made holy, transformed into his likeness, when we enter into the glory of his majestic presence. In a grand sense, the week of unleavened bread symbolizes this entire sanctification process, a microcosm of the entire church age. We are being conformed to the image of Christ, a process that, with respect to the festivals, begins on the first day of unleavened bread. That's the first Sabbath. And is not completed until Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur points to the completion of the process of sanctification. And Yom Kippur is known not as a high Sabbath, but as the Sabbath of all Sabbaths. So whereas the first Sabbath of the week is a remembrance that we are in covenant with him, the last day is a Sabbath because we look to it in anticipation of being face to face with him. A Sabbath of all Sabbaths. When is this day? That day is Shabbat Shabbaton, the Sabbath all Sabbath, the prophetic substance of Yom Kippur, which I like to refer to as Yom Kippur Yovel, O glorious day. So we close with this slide, and then we'll go back to the first slide of the evening so that we can read through that and you can regather your thoughts of the evening. But I'd like to point out now 5 priceless gems of salvation: redemption, deliverance, justification, sanctification, and glorification. So we have been redeemed and delivered and justified. We are being sanctified, and we will be glorified. So you can see the past, present, and future even laid out in these 5 gems of salvation. Sanctification really is not just this portion that I have written here. I really see sanctification as the entire process that's being spoken of up here. And the festivals as a whole speak to the entire process of sanctification from start to finish. When is it completed? When we received our glorified bodies. You know, it's the festivals are such a picture of the Christian life from start to finish. But we have been redeemed. This is Passover. Bought back, delivered, set free, restored to original purpose. We have been delivered, released, liberated, set free, unshackled from a life of slavery to sin. We've been justified, cleansed, restored to a right standing with God, just as if I had never sinned, but just as if he had taken the penalty of my sin for me. We are sanctified, set apart, made holy, separated from the world, and joined to the Lord. Our sanctification is past, present, and future. Sanctification includes consecration. Consecrated. We are set apart for a specific task, ministry, or service. We are ordained, appointed, enabled, equipped, anointed, empowered, given all the authority necessary to fulfill the royal priestly service to which he has called each of us has been assigned. He doesn't just call us as priests and then say, go do it. He equips us to fulfill that. So he gives us the authority to carry that out. We get in trouble when we try and take up authority in an area where we have not been called to.
That's right.
But for our priesthood, he gives us the authority necessary to fulfill it. And we will be glorified, transformed into the likeness of Jesus Christ. So we now return to our cover slide, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. The object of focus is unleavened bread and the removal of leaven, initiation of covenant relationship, and the sanctification of his chosen people, the consecration of his holy priests. So now I ask if there are questions, or are there any insights that you want to share. Certainly if the Holy Spirit has revealed something to you in the course of this teaching, it needs to be shared. Question.
When you have a picture of the table, the Seder meal, I still don't understand the lights.
So those are Shabbat candles. The Jews have a tradition that each Sabbath begins with the woman of the house lighting the Shabbat candles. Okay? When we enter into covenant with him, we enter his rest. There is a rest of God for those who come to him. It's what the weekly Sabbath is a shadow of the Sabbath that we have in God. And so the candles are expressing that it's the beginning of our rest in him. It's a Sabbath rest. The first day of unleavened bread is a high Sabbath. It's all fitting together. But for us, it means we enter into his rest.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So
That was good.
am I not expressing? Can somebody else express it?
I got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? His marvelous light. Yes. 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 It is a picture of him, the light of the world.
That was excellent. I'm not closing it down to say this was excellent because now I've got another picture. I understand.
Any other questions? Come on, Paul. You're usually good for one.
I just thought of the parent conference that I had with the second generation. And the father and the mother both came in. This is like 2 weeks before the end of the term. And they said, both of them talked. First, the mother. She says, he has a C. He's never made a C. Can he do enough reports to make extra credit to get him back to an A? And I didn't say anything. But I was thinking, no. dad said he wasn't doing his work, he didn't get the job done, he didn't make the grades, and yet you want him to do something completely different so he can make an A in the class, not because of math, but because he wants to write reports so he can make a grade. And I said, you just said what I would have said. And it was the difference between the mother and the father. I had them both. I knew where both of them were coming from, but I didn't say anything. And he said what needed to be said that was the best thing for the boy. She wants to keep giving the boy a way out that's not really, and that's why I struggle with this, because you're taking, I'm not trying to say you said something that you didn't say, but you're taking somebody that deserves punishment and you're not giving it to them because of some other reason. And I struggle with that.
That's why it's called the gospel.
Yeah. Right.
Because it's too good to be true for once.
Yeah. But those are the things that are, you talk so fast and you cover a lot. Your teaching is great.
Amen.
But it's just hard to, well, what about this? And then it kind of runs the whole thing, and I don't want to, that's not what I'm trying to do.
I had never got the revelation that the Passover meal before they left Egypt was preparing them, equipping them to be priests.
The significance of it is their priesthood, yes.
I never got that. So thank you. It's got it opens it up for me a whole lot. Now I understand it. Thank you. I mean, I got a lot of other stuff, but I never got that before.
So, Paul, one of the things that I would suggest is that when you have one of those issues that comes up while I'm teaching, you write that down. Have a dedicated page somewhere where you write stuff down. Because otherwise, I mean, if you're anything like me, you'll forget it. You'll forget that there was a tension or there was a lack of explanation at some point. But if you write it down, you can come back to me later and we can fill in between the lines. And you are right. This material is very familiar to me. And so it kind of rolls off my tongue. And it's very fast and fast-moving water. It's not quiet, still waters.
But there's revelation in it. There's revelation in it. I mean, there's things that I have a whole different look at the Seder meal now than I ever had.
It's sitting down, and it is the cutting of the covenant with him.
It's like taking communion.
It is communion.
It is communion, but what I'm saying is, when I take communion, it is holy, and I understand the spiritual significance of it. But with a Seder, I got to be honest with you. In the past, I thought, okay, I do a Seder, but it wasn't significant to me spiritually. But now it is. It's starting. Now it's becoming a part of like communion is. It is significant to me, and I'm getting a revelation of that. Thank you. We'll probably need to do that more. The Seder.
Evelyn?
Hope I can say this. I see that you've spent thousands of hours thinking about this, soaking it up, seeking for understanding. And in so doing, the whole message of salvation has become so enormous. You've done an amazing job expressing it.
Freely I have been given. Freely I give. Freely I have received. Freely I give. I am merely expressing my priesthood. And it's what he gave. It has nothing to do with me.
I think that's one of the most beautiful things I see, because I'll say you are tying together a whole lot of things that I've thought a lot about, but I've never figured out a way to link them all adequately. But you didn't do it. You're just using the festivals, the feasts that God has already.
In the introduction, I explained. No, it's fine. Don't feel bad. And eventually, these tapes will be on the web if you want to go back and listen to them. But in the introduction, I explained how did this come about in me. And when I encountered the Spirit early in my college life, one of the things that began after that was a revelation about a topic here, a revelation about a topic there. It was all disjointed, and you even saw some of that. You experienced some of that in the small group that we had in the church. But it was all disjointed is the point. And at some point, someone handed me a pamphlet, a little fold-out pamphlet that was about the festivals. And as I read that, things slowly began to change. And what happened was, as I began to study the festivals, I realized that all of these disjointed teachings now came to fit someplace in the festival picture, and I like to express it as the decorating of a Christmas tree. The other thing that in the introduction is that about the festivals that the whole church needs to understand. Israel observed these every year. And I mentioned, if God says something once, that's good enough. If he says something twice, you better take note. If he tells you to do it again and again and again and again, there's something powerful there. This is a discipleship program. And you saying that salvation has so much bigger picture is because these are the essential things that God wants us to know. These really aren't the deep things. These are the foundational, the basic things that we should know and understand as Christians. But we don't know the festivals. And so we've made up our own discipleship programs instead of using the one that God put in his word. So I'm not the one to do it, but somebody needs to write a discipleship program based on the festivals, because it deals with the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It deals with the ministry and the indwelling and the empowering of the Holy Spirit. It deals with the resurrection of the dead. It deals with the second coming. And it deals with the marriage supper of the Lamb. All of these are foundational truths of the Christian faith, because this is a discipleship program. Any other questions or comments?
Do you think it would be as easy to teach to go to Israel and teach a bunch of Jews what you're teaching us than it is for us to? We're accepting everything you say.
Listen, Paul knew a whole lot more than I did. And he got fed up with trying to convince the Jews. You see, the whole Jewish approach is to bicker. What's the word I'm looking for? Huh? To bicker, to discuss. And no, it won't work. But what you can hope is that you plant a seed that God will antagonize them with, and that they can't get out of their thoughts even though they disagree with you, so that it pricks their conscience. it's not up to us to bring them to salvation. It's not up to us to bring anybody to salvation. It's a work of the Holy Spirit. So if you're going to debate, that was the word that I looked at. They're all about debate. Where there's two Jews, there's three opinions. That's their own saying. Okay? So it's all about debate. But you can only hope that the Holy Spirit will use something that is said to prick their conscience.
When we took the tour of the temple here in Carbondale, we went through that entire day. We asked a lot of questions and we said a lot of things, during all of that. At the very end, the lady that was over that said to me, she said, "We are just amazed at what you know. And in some instances, I think you know more than we do." But she says, "We are just amazed at what you know." And they understood, I don't want to say the quality of our questions, but the content of it, they understood we were way out there. We were very involved. We understood their religion kind of better than they did. And she said, "We're just amazed at this. And how did you do that?" She said, how do you do that?" And I said, "Because we study," and I had to correct myself. I said, "We study the Old Testament." And I quickly said, "We study the Torah and the prophets. We read the prophets. And we read, your books." And I said, we love them. And she said, "Anytime you want to come back here, you can come back here. We welcome you to come back." But they were amazed at it, but they were delighted that we understood and that we appreciated what they had.
Well, there's a verse in Romans, and I can't quote it exactly, but part of the church's job is to provoke them to jealousy. To provoke them to jealousy. So listen, if they ask you, "Why are you observing Passover? This is ours, and you're taking it as your own." Yeah. That's a good comment, even though they might be angry at you, because it has provoked them.
Yeah.
Because they don't understand why would you have any interest in this when we have all the interest in the world, when you see from shadow to substance.
That's right. We understand it's part of our history. So, but
Other comments?
that's good.
Come on, I like the discussion.
Yeah, this is good. We can provoke them.
You remind me of us being the light of the world also. How could we not be light to them, the Jewish people? And then the final piece of that saying of Jesus right there, what's the outcome of us being light? Blank.
To remove the veil?
Matthew 5:19. What is it?
A bushel hid under a basket.
And on from there, it's also that the glory of God may be revealed.
Right, yes.
Through our good deeds.
Yes. David?
Well, the scripture says until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. So nobody knows when that is. We don't know that number, only God. But when that happens, it says the Jewish people will be saved. So at that point, the veil will be lifted, and they will see the truth of what Jesus Christ really did, and they're going to be all over on the ground on their faces just crying out to God, "Oh, forgive us." It will happen.
We'll discuss that. They will look upon him whom they've pierced, and will mourn for him as an only son. And I personally don't believe that that's at the second coming. I think that's before the second coming.
In Hebrews 9, where he talks about the first covenant had regulations, it's hard to see it here, for worship, and also an earthly sanctuary, and a tabernacle is set up, and the first room where the lampstand and
Well, we in the festival teaching here, I haven't done a whole lot of it yet, but there is a parallel between the festivals and the tabernacle. And really, when we get to Shavuot, which is Pentecost, I will rely heavily on the table of the Lord and the lampstand. Right now, with Passover and unleavened bread and first fruit, we are in the court. We are at the altar, because that's where the body and the blood of the sacrifice is dealt with. But not only do you have the animal sacrifice, the body and the blood, you have the grain offering, which is a crude form of bread, with its libation, which is wine. So you have the body and the blood, you have bread and wine. So it's referring to the sacrifice and the word and the spirit. So it's all wrapped up in the altar. And then the laver talks about sanctification, which we talked about tonight. It's all the washing of the water with the word. It's all, we're these first three festivals, we are in the court. But for Pentecost, we'll be going into the holy place. And for the final three festivals, trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles, we're talking about passing within the veil and coming to within the Holy of Holies. So there's a direct correlation between the festivals and the temple. I think everybody here has their name. Well, maybe not. If you want to receive the handouts, there's a sheet on the table, I believe, if it made it back there, for people's email address, and I send out, hopefully on Sunday night every week, the notes for the next Tuesday night. So if people are coming, they can print it out. There were instructions with the first send. I should probably send that out a couple more times with the handouts, but of how to set up to print it with a PDF printer, so that you get it set on booklet, print on both sides of the page, and then you have to know, if you don't have a duplex printer, you have to know how to flip your pages to get it to print on both sides. You can still get the booklet printed, but it's a little more difficult. So, anything else to deal with tonight?
It was excellent. It was really good.
Well, thank him. Tell him.
I do.
Because if there's anything good that has been said, it didn't come from me. It's by way of revelation.
Now, next week is first fruit.
Next week is first fruits.
I'm excited.
Yeah. Yes.